From Brigham Young University's Maxwell Institute, this is the Maxwell Institute podcast, Faith Illuminating Scholarship. My name is Rosalynde Welch. I host the podcast, and today I have for you the fourth and final in a series of interviews with the Maxwell Institute's new cohort of faculty fellows, this time featuring the wonderful Dr. Katie Paxman, who is visiting us from her home department of philosophy. First, though, I want to remind you of a project we've had running all year, which will be wrapping up at the end of 2025. We've gathered some of the best of Elder Neal A. Maxwell's previously unpublished speeches from across his career in ministry, and every 2 weeks we post one of those speeches on our blog. I've been sharing these speeches with my son, who doesn't remember Elder Maxwell personally, but has come to love his signature style of reasoned, literate faith. The speeches will remain archived on our website, but don't miss the last of the series as we roll them out. Turning now to my conversation with Dr. Katie Paxman. Dr. Paxman has joined us at the Institute to work on a book for our Living Faith series, tentatively titled More to Question, More to Believe. As that title suggests, she doesn't see questions and belief as opposites, but as partners that expand and build on each other. Katie specializes in epistemology, the study of what we know and how we know it, and she uses her expertise to dig into how we form religious beliefs, what happens when we question those beliefs, and how we can approach the whole thing with more joy and confidence. Katie helped me see that although it feels like my beliefs and questions reside in my own head, they actually are a deeply social process. And if I feel stuck, the way forward may be social as well as mental. We explored the difference between doubt and questioning. Doubt is a disposition, while questioning is a tool for seeking knowledge. It's possible, for instance, to be a dogmatic doubter with no questions at all. And Katie gave one of the most insightful explanations I've ever heard of Elder Dieter Uchtdorf's famous admonition to doubt your doubts. This is actually the second time Dr. Paxman has spoken with me on the podcast. In 2023, she joined me for a great discussion about skepticism, philosophy, and faith. So if you like today's episode, make sure to go back and find our earlier conversation. And with that, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Katie Paxman. Katie Paxman, welcome back to the Maxwell Institute podcast.
I always like talking to you, so I'm happy to be here.
Katie, you are an epistemologist, and you're here at the Maxwell Institute to work on a project about epistemology. To a lot of readers, that may sound sort of dry, irrelevant, complex, but I want to make the case, and I think you will also, that it's very relevant to our lives. So think about this scenario, and I think it's happened to all of us. You're talking with somebody, maybe you're conversing online, and suddenly something that you believe is challenged. And you respond in a very visceral way. Let me put it in personal terms. I respond in a very visceral way. This happens to me.
You are not alone.
Yeah. Panicky. I feel threatened. It doesn't happen to me all the time with any time that I'm questioned or challenged, but there are certain topics where I'll respond in this sort of deeply visceral way to having what I think I know, what I believe challenged. What's happening in that situation? Is that a question of epistemology right there in that very human moment?
I think that's a question of psychology, human psychology, and it's human psychology as it pertains to our social epistemic practices, which is like a fancy, philosophers like fancy big words, partly because when you have a technical term, of course, you can have a lot of precision in how you speak, and often these are pretty complicated concepts. So I often tell my students, big words are kind of shortcuts, right? So that I don't have to spend a paragraph describing the concept. So that aside, what I mean is that we have certain belief-forming practices, as a matter of fact, and those practices and the presence of beliefs and how we come to have beliefs are really importantly integrated with how we understand ourselves in our social context. So my source of identity is often tied up in my beliefs. My sense of whether or not I am justified in asserting that identity is often tied up in how I take myself to have justified the beliefs I hold. And maybe more importantly, in the scenario you're talking about, I'm going to worry about whether others, those I'm engaging, are going to say I'm justified to hold those beliefs. And that's not because most of us are academics or scientists who say, the most important thing to me is the truth, and therefore I have to make sure I have real clarity on the warrant for the belief I hold. For most of us, that has more to do with whether or not I can show up with a certain degree of confidence and self-assurance. Yeah. If my identity is tied to a set of beliefs, or I understand that a set of beliefs are important to my identity, I think a lot of people, we read something online, and whether we consciously think, oh no, my identity is in danger or not, we respond that way. Yeah. We respond as though it is a threat to who we are, to the spaces we stand in, and whether or not we're right to be standing in those spaces. And given that those spaces are often places where we feel secure, we feel comfort, we feel belonging, challenges to that status can trigger like a fight or flight or freeze response. Yeah. And I actually think that that when you come to the internet, understanding how many people might be in that heightened state when they engage in online debate, I think it really changes how you perceive what's going on. When you perceive what looks like aggression, not as, man, that person's mean, and instead, that person's responding as though they're being threatened. I wonder why. Right?
Well, that's a really good point. And I appreciate that, because you've shifted me into not only thinking about how I'm responding in those moments. And I think you're right that it often does happen online, but sometimes in person too, to helping me realize that other people are having that same experience as well. And so, as you say, what looks like aggression or, just coming on way too strong might actually be its opposite, right? It might not be an overabundance of confidence, but it actually might be masking a kind of shame. If we feel confident, when we believe that when we hold beliefs that are justified, and we feel calm and able to defend those beliefs, the flip side of that is that when we start to question, sometimes we can feel shame. And maybe we try to bury that shame or compensate for it in some way. Yeah. Talk to me about the relationship between uncertainty and shame.
Yes, this is a great question. So uncertainty, we tend to find really uncomfortable. Something that I've been thinking a lot about lately is that is not, I think, our starting position with uncertainty. And by that, I mean, children are uncertain. They don't know anything, right? Now, some children at earlier ages begin to get anxious about not having the answers. They might learn that from watching adults, right? But I think if you look at developmental psychology, there's this great book by Alison Gopnik, who's a psychologist and philosopher. It's called The Philosophical Baby, and she tracks development and learning, especially through early years, like through infant to toddler. And she basically makes the argument that little people are little philosophers. They're little scientists. They are incredibly driven to understand the world around them. And that is an advantage to a young creature, to be curious and to be constantly seeking. And I don't think the experience of not knowing is unpleasant in that setting. In fact, I think it's often energizing and motivating.
I've heard that talked about as beginner's mindset, right? If you can kind
Yeah,
of put
yeah,
yourself in the mindset of a beginner, you don't feel shame about not knowing anything. You
yeah,
just feel excitement about what you can still know. It's
yeah.
once we start to think of ourselves as experts or as knowledgeable, that's when the shame can set in, when we realize, oh, I don't know that.
Yeah, and so one of the things that Gopnik tracks that I think is really interesting is she says that humans, we actually function really well having both innovators, questioners, which a lot of the time the young are filling that role, but also having adults who have learned patterns. We know that our brains make a ton of new connections when we're young, and then they start pruning. So there's this suggestion that as we learn which patterns, which beliefs about cause and effect and the structure of the world are practical for us, that we begin to kind of the world stops looking like this wide open set of questions and uncertainties where I'm investigating everything. You know, I drop something once, I pick it up and do it again because I don't know yet that it's going to drop every single time, right? And you see babies doing this and toddlers just testing things from all different angles. And in some of the studies that Gopnik has done, they can actually see how thorough toddlers are in gathering that information. That they're very good systematic scientists, it turns out, and inquirers. But as adults, it's actually much more practical. We're more functional when we're not constantly seeking and reevaluating, and instead, when we've begun to kind of map the world, map the causal world, right? So we've got set in our minds, A is tied to B in this particular way, and I can expect it to happen this way every time. And now I can make decisions quickly. I can evaluate situations quickly. And most of the things we learn are things that are serving us well, getting us where we need to go. So why does discomfort and maybe even shame become part of feeling like those patterns are challenged? Well, discomfort, I think, is partly because we've got a greater sense of the responsibility to make things work, right? We're trying to function well in our world. We're social creatures. And as we age, we get an increased sense not of our dependence on others, but others' dependence on us, right?
Yeah, maybe we think of ourselves as a teacher or somebody who's looked up to as an authority, or we've testified to these beliefs in the past, right? And so suddenly that's a lot scarier to think maybe I don't know all those things that I said.
And shame is importantly, it's not, we don't tend to feel shame in a very private way when we make a mistake. We feel shame often because that we are perceiving that others have perceived. Now, when I say that, it's possible to feel shame about something no one else knows about. Maybe it's because you think God has seen you. But we also have a relationship with self, right? And the self can be pretty judgmental. Raise your hand if you've ever thought not nice things about yourself. So in any of these cases, though, it's a kind of social phenomena. We're worried about our social status. So when the systems that we've come to use that are serving us well are challenged, we're going to feel uncomfortable, not just because I don't like not knowing what to do, or I don't like the suggestion that I don't know what to do, but also because that we're so hyper aware of the social world. I like to think that the human world is socially saturated. Even when I'm alone, the things I see have meaning to me because of the way they figure into, say, my social status or my position or my security or my belonging. So the shame, I think, comes because that I'm very aware of how other people are depending on me, maybe how other people are evaluating me, who I want to appear to other people, whether or not I belong. And I'm going to continue to experience social security through acceptance. So these are all, I think, in the background of the discomfort we feel. And as you say, we sometimes overcompensate for or kind of get aggressive or panicked because that we are trying to defend that sense of self and security.
So I think these principles apply broadly across many aspects of our life, but they're especially salient in our religious lives,
Mm-hmm.
especially as Latter-day Saints, where number one, we have a very thick community, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know our wards, we love the people there, and we care about what they think about us, right? So all those social mechanisms you were talking about come into
Mm-hmm.
play. And second of all, beliefs are very important in our religious lives, and we do identify with them, right? I think of myself, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I believe such and such and such and such. So this is a kind of recipe, our religious lives as members of the church, a recipe for a certain way of relating to questions and even doubts that can breed a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a lot of panic. I love the way I've heard you talking in the past about how we form beliefs and how we approach questions. And one of the things you've made me really reconsider is the relationship between questions and answers, right? If I was playing an opposites game with a kid and I said, "What's the opposite of a question?" they'd probably say, "Well, an answer." But I've heard, as you've talked and we've gotten to know each other, I've started to think about this differently. Maybe questions and answers, questions and beliefs aren't actually opposites. Maybe they're more like partners, right? Maybe it's not a zero sum relationship. So the more that I question, the less that I know. Maybe it's kind of a positive sum relationship, right? The more that we question, the more we can know. And the more that we know, the more we can question. So talk to me about this relationship between questions and beliefs, questions and answers.
Okay. I mean, I love this topic. Um, Here's one way I like to think about it. You know how when you're getting advice for going to a job interview, one of the things you're told to anticipate is they will ask you if you have any questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, and if you've ever, and I know you have, hired, interviewed people before, yes, I might say, do you have any questions? Because I sincerely would like to answer the questions of someone, make sure they know what's going on. But that's actually also an interview question, right? Because for someone to have questions, they have to have given thought to the place of work, the job. Questions often indicate how well people understand. So this is really interesting because we feel like if I say no questions, that's a great way to broadcast confidence that I understand what's going on because I understand it so completely.
Yes,
I have
I
no
have
questions,
no questions left.
right?
Yeah.
But actually, it turns out that if you have a lot of robust questions, that's usually an indication you've really grappled with the ideas. Your questions don't need to indicate a fundamental, I just don't even understand what we're talking about here. In fact, if you don't understand what we're talking about, you're only going to have one question and it's going to be kind of like, huh? Right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I like, huh? Exactly because there's nothing articulated there. It isn't a good question. It's not really a question, right? It's an indication of not even being able to kind of get an edge to get into an idea. On the other hand, I think that a fun game that philosophers play all the time is take something that's common sense that you do know, you're sure you know, and see how many questions you can ask about it. So here's an example. René Descartes famously says, I think, therefore I am, right? Yeah. I am, I exist. This is supposed to be the belief he has, the knowledge he has that can't be doubted. Because if I exist, I can't doubt that I'm existing because it takes existence in order to be a doubting thing, etc. Right? So does that mean I don't have any questions? Not at all. Look at that phrase. I think, therefore I am. Descartes. And I might say, yes, I believe that's true. Do I have questions about it? For sure. What do I mean by I? And what's the difference between thinking about a general I, so taking that statement is kind of abstracted, or thinking about me, myself. So what do I mean by I, as opposed to what do people mean by I? Think. What is it to think? Does it require consciousness? Is it just a series of algorithms that can play out without feeling, right?
Yeah.
What is it to be?
That's so good. Okay, so what Descartes was trying to do was get down to what is undoubtable, what is indubitable, right? And so he, through these reasonings, he gets down to this idea that if I'm even thinking, then my existence is indubitable. It's undoubtable because only an existing thing can think. But what you're saying is that indubitability doesn't mean unquestionability. So we can be secure in a belief that we no longer experience doubt around. Nevertheless, and almost because of that security, it can generate many, many questions from that place of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. I think that the book I'm working on is tentatively titled More to Question, More to Believe. I think this is a really good illustration of that, because if I believe, let's say I exist, no further questions, I can't generate questions, that's actually a pretty small amount of content. If I have a whole series of questions about, what's the nature of thinking? What's the nature of the self or the I that's being discussed here? What's the nature of being in existence? What do I mean by making a claim like that? If I have that series of questions, that actually indicates there's more content in my mind about that initial claim, even if that content leads to all kinds of open doors, right? Yeah. All kinds of things I don't know. Turns out more to question with the right sorts of questions is an indication of more to believe, is an indication of a more robust set of ideas that you're committing to, that you're interested in, that you're able to grapple with. So my experience has been questioning results in more to understand, more to believe, more to feel, more to connect with, and more to simultaneously question, but also feel a sense of self-efficacy and of who I am.
Let's take a brief moment to acknowledge an enthusiasm that you and I share, which is for a little known musical film starring Barbara Streisand called Yentl. I was absolutely delighted to know that this has been a major touchstone for you. In fact, it's the source of the title of your book, More to Question, More to Believe. Yentl is a film that I knew so well growing up. My mother loved it. We listened to it on vinyl records and then on cassette tapes in the car. It's a wonderful story. Briefly tell us about Yentl and the relationship of that story to this project.
Absolutely. I always talk about Yentl. So I watched Yentl probably for the first time when I was around, I think, 11 or 12 years old. My mom showed me. It was on a VHS taped off of TV. For any younger members of the audience, you can Google what that process was. And I just fell in love with it. It's about a Jewish girl who's in her late 20s at the turn of the last century. And her father has taught her, she's in a very conservative community, very Orthodox community in Europe. And her father has taught her to read in secret. And she hasn't gotten married. And that's where the film starts, is that she's got all these questions, and a lot of her questions are tied up around her identity, because that she feels like she's getting messaging from her community. She ought to be married. She ought to be having children. She doesn't need to be able to read. She shouldn't be asking so many questions. But that's not what she's experiencing. She feels like God has given her the ability to think, and God has given her these questions, and she wants to know God. She loves God. The very beginning of the film, this isn't really a spoiler, this is the setup for the entire thing, is that her father passes away. And it looks like now the community is kind of going to ensure that she gets married, taken care of. And Yentl doesn't want that. And so she pulls a Mulan before Mulan. She cuts her hair, dresses as a boy, and travels so that she can go to a school. And then the film plays out, and it's dramatic, but a theme that runs through it is someone grappling with the presence of these overwhelming questions in their life, this tendency to question, that fills them up, that feels like a gift from God, and yet often end up being the source of conflict socially, of problems, of troubles. Like, she's not able to passively accept what the world is passing her. So yeah, as a young person, I got super excited. I mean, it's Barbara Streisand singing inner monologues the entire time about being misunderstood by her community, because I was the girl in Young Women's who wanted to talk more about the scriptures. And when someone brought in their baby and everyone else stopped and wanted to play with the baby, look, I had nothing against babies. I was there to, can we talk about the scriptures? Like, can we talk now? This is slightly spoilery, but in the course of the film, Yentl actually learns better to appreciate the traditional female roles that she didn't understand and connect with. And that's been a really exciting process in my life as well, actually, starting with my nephews and then having my own children, realizing just how many good questions I have to ask about motherhood and about the distinctive things that the female body can do and what that means for the social roles we play. It's a great movie.
I've noticed that about you, Katie. I love how talking about, the most complex philosophical questions and problems, you'll bring them back to a relationship between a parent and a child, or a scenario in a household that we've all experienced. I love how you do that. Let's go back just a little bit, thinking more about questions versus doubts. Sometimes I've noticed, and maybe I've done it myself, that I can use the idea of a question as just a sort of euphemism for doubt, or a way to make doubt seem less scary. So if I'm concerned that my child is having some doubts about their beliefs in the gospel or something, I might frame that as, oh, you have questions, right? Talk to me. Is that, is it the case that questions and doubts really share a lot in common? Are they distinct? And then especially, I want to hear you talk about Elder Uchtdorf's famous encouragement in 2013 in his conference talk, "Come Join With Us," to doubt our doubts.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about doubt.
Yeah. So first of all, Elder Uchtdorf, I don't know if he identifies as an epistemologist, but I have ample evidence from his talks that he is frequently doing very good epistemology, and I very much appreciate that. Doubt and question, I think we do in casual ways use the terms synonymously. We ought not, at least in the sense that if someone says they have a question, I shouldn't hear, oh, they have doubts. Similarly, if someone says, I have doubts, that doesn't mean they have a question. So doubting is a disposition towards some particular claim, right? Towards maybe a belief. And I can be very dogmatically doubting and not being engaging in any kind of curiosity or seeking.
Real questioning,
Exactly. So someone can make a claim and I can say, I don't believe that. And that's not me saying, here's a question I have about that claim. Here's something I don't understand about it. Here's why I'm hesitant to believe that. Let me ask you this, right? That's really different from just, nope. Similarly, you might have someone whose doubt isn't of the kind of defensive against, but is kind of internal. Sometimes our doubt is just the fear we might be wrong. And whether or not we have good reasons or any reasons for thinking we might be wrong, we can have that fear that I might be wrong, right? So doubt seems to be a very distinct phenomena from questioning, which, as I said before, I believe, I am, I exist. I got a whole series of follow-up questions. So that
undoubtable,
doesn't
but
at all
full of questions.
Amount to a doubt. Now, I don't want to make doubt quite sound like the bad guy here, Because once we identify doubt with things like fear, it's never helpful to tell yourself, I ought not to feel a particular way. Instead, when I'm having a kind of doubt response where I feel myself not being curious, shutting down, right? Not wanting to ask questions, like I'm just saying, okay, well, either I have to dogmatically, like I'm just going to hold on to something and believe it and put on my blinders and go la, 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 la. Or on the other hand, I can't be certain of that, so I'm just going to become a complete skeptic. You know what? I doubt it, and so now I'm closed off. I don't want to believe because I don't want to make a mistake, right? When we have either of those responses, stopping and paying attention to what I'm feeling, and then I can ask questions. Why is this so scary? Why is this so hard? What do I think is going to happen? Is this about relationships in my life? Am I worried that someone isn't going to accept me or isn't going to love me? Is this about not being sure I've done the right thing? Is this about, you can see there's so many different questions we can start to ask if we get curious about our own feelings. And there's this great thing where when I notice the feeling and accept it and allow myself to feel it, it actually frees up my brain from being in that fight or flight place where I'm kind of frozen. It frees me up to actually process through and maybe feel more comfortable, feel more secure, feel some self-acceptance.
Questions can be the remedy to that feeling that we started out with, right? That feeling of I'm trapped, I'm ashamed, I'm being attacked. Questions can actually be one way to move beyond that state of mind.
Yeah. So when Elder Uchtdorf says doubt your doubts, I've occasionally heard people use it, not meaning to be mean, I think, but it's occasionally used to shut down questioning, the sense that one ought not to say in a Sunday school lesson, bring up a question that doesn't allow us to all comfortably nod to something that we say we're all meant to know, right? Maybe someone brings up a question that makes them uncomfortable, makes other people uncomfortable. And someone might say, well, doubt your doubts. And the thing they're communicating is stop making everyone feel uncomfortable, right? Yeah. That's not, especially when you look in the context of the talk, that's not what Elder Uchtdorf is saying. I think what Elder Uchtdorf is saying is actually a lot more similar to something that the philosopher I study, David Hume, who's famously skeptical in a lot of his philosophical methodologies. He says at the end of a really important section of his treatise on human nature, he has just considered a ton of really difficult skeptical arguments against pretty fundamental philosophical claims, like the nature of causality and whether or not I can know that some object I perceive has identity. Do I know that my laptop is the same laptop over time? This is the kind of things that some people hear that philosophers are working on and they wonder why I'm getting paid. But I promise these are actually really important things to think through insofar as, among other things, they help us establish what we mean and what we mean by saying that we believe in certain things. So Hume's just exposed his reader and himself to all these really difficult questions. And he hasn't then rescued everyone, right? He hasn't said, but don't worry, here's an argument. He's kind of left you out. He uses the metaphor, in fact, of being out to sea. He says, I'm trying to sail around the earth in a leaky rowboat. And that's what he thinks human reason and the mind is this attempt at a really big task in an instrument that seems not quite up to it. And it's in that context that he reminds himself that he ought to be diffident of his philosophical doubts just as much as he is of any attempts at certainty, which is to say, he says, look, I've gotten really good at looking at my beliefs and challenging them. I ought to be just as good at looking at the source of my doubts, my skepticism, and questioning it, right? And I think that's what Elder Uchtdorf is saying. Hang on a second. shifting to a different dogmatic belief, or shifting to some other space where you say, I don't want to have to feel uncertain about things, so I'm going to make things really black and white. That move, that needs to be treated with the same kind of thorough questioning and careful questioning, that you ought to doubt your doubts. You ought to, when doubt is increasingly the experience, maybe what we were talking about before, where you stop and say, what am I feeling? And why am I feeling this? And do I need to? And maybe it isn't just questions, because that often I think this is a case of kind of social insecurity or disconnectedness. When I'm in that space, I might have a tendency to kind of cut myself off from other people, like,
yeah,
I'm being deep, and I've thought all these deep thoughts, and I'm
see.
in an
Not
angsty
shame, but
place.
Superiority, right? A sense
Well,
that
maybe,
or
I'm
the real free thinker, and I don't really have anything to learn.
Yeah. So there can be pride connected with it.
Yeah.
There can also be this belief that I'm so fundamentally different from other people because I'm experiencing this, that I have to be alone. This is something in that section of Hume I was talking about. He says, he describes himself as a monster, and that he looks at the people around him who are connecting with each other and functioning well, and he can't imagine how someone like him could go into that space where other people seemed like, how many of us feel this sometimes, right? Where we're feeling really alienated, and we look out and see other people who, by the way, probably are secretly going through all kinds of anxieties of their own, but they're masking it and they're talking to one another. And what I see is this deep level of social belonging and connection. And I think I compare myself to it and say, I don't have that. And Hume says, I'm too monstrous. No one's going to want me as part of their group. But then he goes on to write, the real solution to this feeling is not more philosophy. He says, I need to go play a board game with my friends. I'm not kidding. He says he should go play backgammon with his friends. He talks about the need to reconnect socially, and that once he's reconnected socially, we might now talk about regulating, right? That he can return to these big ideas and questions, and he can do it in a way where now it's a pleasure for him instead of a source of deep anxiety and insecurity. And I think that another thing that is so important to remember is just how often in Scripture we're told to be like children. And when a child is feeling sad or upset, most of the time, what they will do is let that vulnerability be obvious, right? We do this thing where we think we have to already have managed ourselves and have made sure that I'm not going to present as needing. I don't want to be needy, right? So I deny myself social connection until I feel like I can mask whatever pain I'm feeling or difficulty I'm experiencing. But that's not what children do. And I think when we are told to be like children, we are certainly encouraged to come to God as a child. So come to God in your hurt, right? Tell him what hurts. Tell him what feels vulnerable. But I think we're also meant to form relationships with others where we're willing to do that. So when you're feeling that deep disconnect, maybe it's too big of an ask to say, okay, pull up your socks and go play a board game, right? Or go make small talk with someone. I think we have to be taking really seriously, though, the possibility that what we ought to be doing is going to someone and saying, I feel horrible. I want to hide. I'm feeling so disconnected right now. Now, that's going to be something where you say, okay, well, I need a person that's okay for me to do that with. And I think ideally, these are the relationships we have with our closest friends and our family. When our that isn't feeling like it's there for us, I think actually that's part of the reason we have ministering and we have local church leaders, because having someone who's been put in a position where the expectation is they'll be available to others' vulnerability, it gives us a social structure that I think allows allows us to find that space, especially if other relationships in our life are fraught or uncomfortable.
I love that vision of ministering, in addition to, meeting emergent physical needs. That's such an important role as well. But what if I can't do that, right? For some reason, for my ministering sister, what if I can be that person that she can come to when meaning has crumbled in her life and she's feeling that kind of deep social alienation? What if I were the one that she felt safe to come to? What an honor, what a privilege. That would truly be a ministry right there.
Yeah.
Katie, this has been such a great conversation. We're going to draw it to a close now. As we wrap up, I would just like to hear briefly what makes for an excellent question, right? We've talked about questioning, how important it is. It's different from doubting. Questioning supports our belief and leads us to better justified beliefs. But not all questions are created equal. So what makes an excellent question? And maybe what's a practical thing that listeners can do to kind of improve their questions, to practice asking better questions?
Yeah. I want to talk really quickly about two kinds of problematic questions. The first sort of ill-formed question is a question that builds in some assumption about the world that might not be true, and then appears to force you to choose, right? So here's a good example. In philosophy, we call this a false dichotomy. Someone says either there is a God, and because he's all good, no one ever experiences pain, or people experience pain, and that means there's no God, right? That's a false dichotomy. I didn't frame that as a question, or reframe it in your mind as a question. And as a question, it actually does a lot of building up what reality is like. And it says it's either A or it's B. Now you have to pick one. That's not a great question, right? Because sometimes questions like that can be really distorting. They can lead us down paths where we're working really hard to find an answer between only these two things, and that neither of them are what the world looks like. So one way a question can be weaker or stronger is the degree to which it builds in assumptions about the world that maybe themselves need to be questioned and considered. And we can do that without meaning to. We do that all the time. It's part of the process. I never want to make someone stop questioning because they're worried that they're asking the wrong question. But this is where questioning our questions becomes really useful, right? Yeah. However, I think we've also all been in scenarios where a question is framed like that, and we think that the questioner is doing it that way on purpose, right? That there's something manipulative, that there's something insincere. That's the second type of problematic question that I think is worth thinking about. Why is the questioner asking that question? Is the question meant to impact the person who's listening, manipulate them in some way, or make them feel badly about themselves? It's interesting. I was looking at two of the most important questions in Scripture. So the Moroni's encouraging us to ask whether the Book of Mormon is true. And then in James, Joseph Smith's the question he comes across or says that we ought to ask God questions. In both cases, faith is highlighted. And I think faith in this context is best word is trust in God. So it's relational. So the first thing about a good question, if you're asking, especially in a social context, a good question, there is going to be a love, a real relationship between the two people and a kind of trust between the two parties. And then it talks about a sincere heart, real intent. In other words, I'm asking in earnest. I'm not asking a question to manipulate someone else or to force their hand or to prove a point that has nothing to do with my commitment to the truth. And instead, maybe it's kind of just how I want things to turn out, right? Questions that have a lot of that energy behind them or that seem to be about trying to bully others or push others those are questions maybe we should step back from and think about. Now, how to ask good questions. This is a hard topic. Here's the starting place I'm going to give, because that it just feels practical to me. If you look at a question, it's a bunch of words. All those words have meaning. And one of the things philosophers love to do is point out how many sentences that we really all take ourselves to understand. If we actually take the individual words, we find, actually, I've got a lot of questions. There are things I don't know about this, right? So kind of what I modeled earlier with I am, I exist, or I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Common sense, I know what all those words mean. I understand what someone means when they say them to me. But if I slow down and consider the components of that sentence, or that question, I should say, then I can generate all kinds of questions about it. I can think more deeply about the details. And this can apply to all kinds of claims. It can apply to scripture. That's not the only way to generate questions, but I think that's a really neat starting place, is to look at the components, the concepts, and the way they're related to each other in any claim we're considering, and use that as a way to start generating questions.
I think slow down is good advice in many contexts, and I think it's spectacular advice in the context of reading, understanding, seeking, and questioning. Thank you, Katie Paxman, for joining us today on the Maxwell Institute podcast.
So much fun. Thank you. Great questions about questions.
That's it for my interview with Dr. Katie Paxman. We're delighted to have her with us for the next couple of years, and I can't wait to see what she writes during her time at the Maxwell Institute. If you want to hear more from Katie, check out her Wonder of Scripture lecture from October 2025, available on the Maxwell Institute website, mi.byu.edu, and our YouTube channel. It's titled Wonder, Curiosity, and Reading Scripture Like a Child. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll tell somebody about it. I'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you for listening. We do what we do because of our audience, and we're grateful for you.